And with that, Chris, why don't you just go ahead and take it away? If you don't know Chris yet, we were delighted to have Chris with us again. Chris is a investor, an author, an educator, and a friend of Silicon Valley Forum. So, Chris, why don't you go ahead and start?
Thanks so much, Nick. First of all, I want to appreciate everyone taking time out of their busy schedules to come by. I know that given your heavy travel load, it's very difficult to make time for something like this. So I always am glad to see people here. On a more serious note, obviously, we're here in a time of great turmoil in the United States. I can't really possibly do it justice to comment on it, so I'll just say that I hope that everyone out there is safe and doing whatever is necessary to stay safe and healthy. So the topic of today is all about how do you find the right people to surround yourself with? And specifically, we're talking about co-founders and advisors and investors and employees. But it really is about assembling a team, because when it comes down to it, if you think about entrepreneurship is a team sport. It's very rare that a great entrepreneur built the company all by themselves and ran that company for 30 years all by themselves. We can't find a single example of that. If you go back and say, Steve Jobs, yes, he built each iPhone individually until his death. Not true. And so recruiting and identifying and bringing in a team is so essential. And it's especially essential for founders who are starting out. When you're starting out, you probably don't have any money. You may or may not have any specific resources that will allow you to get everything done. And so a big part of whether or not you succeed is going to depend on your ability to convince other people to join your cause, despite the fact that the chances of that cause succeeding are low, and despite the fact that you can't offer them a lot of immediate reward for joining that cause. So the question becomes, how do you actually manage this? How do you get people to join a company that is based in your home, although technically all companies are based in our homes now, and get them to actually sacrifice for something that is very uncertain to occur? So I'll cover a couple of specific areas and we'll talk about them in turn, and then I'll leave plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. So the first area I'm going to talk about is, how do you actually identify people that you want to bring onto your team? So this is a very straightforward principle, which is, if you want to get people on your team, if you want to engage with people, the best thing to do is to start engaging with them early. Build your network, because if you wait until it's time to start recruiting people, recruiting investors, recruiting advisors, by that time, what's the process you're going to go through? Let's say you want to bring on a co-founder. Do you go to www.cofounder.com and find a marketplace of co-founders, look at their ratings, and then just pick one and ask for them to be delivered next Tuesday? No, that's not the way it works. There isn't an easy way to do this. And so the best way to do this is to begin building your network in advance. And that means every time you meet a smart and interesting person, making an effort to connect and stay in touch. This is one of my famous pieces of advice. People ask me, Chris, you seem to know a lot of famous and important people. Why is that the case? I say, well, you just get to know people and then you wait 10 to 20 years and magically good things happen. And of course, not everyone that you meet 10 or 20 years ago has turned into, I don't know, a US senator, a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, or a famous venture capitalist. But the more smart and interesting people you meet and stay in touch with, the more likely it is that someday you will be sitting in the office of a US senator, a Fortune 500 CEO, or a famous venture capitalist and talking about the good old days. So begin by building your network. Again, stay in touch with smart and interesting people. Now, how do you actually do that? It's very easy to say, stay in touch with smart and interesting people. And it's sort of like telling people, it's very easy to lose weight. Just go ahead, eat less, exercise more. Pretty soon you'll have a six-pack and be a fitness model. I haven't found that to be the case. Nick, do you find that to be the case? I actually haven't seen your abs recently. No? You're saying no? Okay. So how do you actually do this? Stay in touch with smart and interesting people. Well, I have a simple process that I follow. If I meet a smart and interesting person, oftentimes it takes place at an event or because maybe we corresponded online or something like that. The next step is to set up one-on-one time. I'm a big believer that relationships are still developed one-on-one. You're not going to meet and develop a deep and abiding friendship with someone that you never see by themselves, that you always see as a group. I mean, it doesn't work that way. So set up a one-on-one time. In the old days, I would often do like a lunch or a coffee. Today it would be more like a Zoom. Hopefully we'll be back to the old-fashioned ways at some point in time in the near future. But even now, you can still set up a Zoom, get to know someone. And really, with these meetings, it's always been the case. I want to understand more about them. I want to understand, where they grew up. What are the things that are important to them? Because only by understanding those things are you able to build a deeper relationship. Getting to know people simply for what they can do for you is not a recipe for having them want to see you. If the only time you show up on their virtual doorstep is when you need something, they're not going to be primed to actually say yes when that time comes. So set up that one-on-one meeting after the initial meeting. And then after that, stay in touch, ping now and then. I will often follow people on social media. If they have a blog or a LinkedIn feed, I'll comment and engage. And this does two things. The first, it means that they know that I care. Of course, you have to engage in a constructive and valuable way, as opposed to just sort of, I won't say the name. There is a company that I am an advisor to. And the founder or CEO, they actually have built tools for social media engagement. And I'm like, okay, how does it work? It's like, oh, well, we build this bot that uses your social media accounts and goes out and engages on your behalf. I'm like, really? This is a new one on me. I've heard of bots being deployed by foreign governments, but not by individuals yet. And so I began looking for this individual's posts, and I saw that what this person would do is go out and post on LinkedIn and other places. Great post, great point, love that idea, etc. Basically, it's a list of like 7 or 8 generic things that could apply to anything. It's sort of like a horoscope. If anyone remembers reading a horoscope in a newspaper, again, there used to be things called newspapers. But if anyone remembers reading a horoscope, these horoscopes are written so that they can apply to anyone. And so it's not that the horoscope is accurate. It's just they've said something that could apply anywhere. And so when somebody says, great point to your post, most people are egotistical enough that they're like, yeah, that's awesome. I enjoy that person. Anyways, now that I've seen it, I've seen this individual post on my social media accounts, and I occasionally ask him offline via email, so was that you or was that the bot? Usually he's like, yeah, that was the bot. So my point is that the algorithm, that's intended to tap into the algorithms of social media. The more you like someone's content or engage with someone's content, the more Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn is going to show you that person's content. And so actually engaging serves two purposes. One is the actual demonstration of interest, and the other is the fact that algorithmically, you are going to see more of their content. They're going to see more of your content. Every day, with every like that you make, with every comment that you make, you're actually choosing who you're going to be with and who you're going to learn about. And so choose wisely. But social media is a huge tool for being able to maintain these relationships in a way that simply wasn't possible before. Finally, I would say that, as interesting things come up, always share with them via LinkedIn message or email or whatever the best mechanism for a one-on-one communication is. Because I tell you all the time, people send me things that I hadn't seen, and I value that. And everyone needs good information. Now, the information has to be good. You can't say, hey, I saw this story on the front page of the New York Times, and I thought of you. Guess what? It's pretty likely they already know about it. So it should be something that is more specialized, more interesting, more specific to them. And again, it has to be based on that sincere interest in them and what they're doing. But if you do that, if you meet people, if you set up that one-on-one meeting, and you do the follow-up via social media and other mechanism, then over time you'll have the kind of relationship where you're able to now gauge them over time. And that's part of the equation, right? It's not just about building this relationship and being able to call on people. It's also about evaluating them. It doesn't matter how famous someone is, how rich someone is. It still doesn't mean that they're necessarily the right person for your team. So now let's talk about how you decide from all those wonderful relationships that you've created, which people you want on your team. So a lot of times people just sort of say, you know who I want on my team? I want a friend on my team. I want somebody who I like spending time with. You know what? That's a great initial filter. because you should absolutely want to spend time with the advisors, with the co-founders, with the investors that you bring in. But that is not the only filter, right? Because the fact is that the social interactions we have and actually doing work on an important topic are two very different things altogether. And the people who are great friends socially may not necessarily be great collaborators. A person who is a great collaborator probably will be a friend, but the other is not necessarily true. I'm sure all of us have friends that we know and have enjoyed spending time with that we wouldn't say, hire to be the chief operating officer of our company. So you have to apply the second filter of, well, how compatible are you from a work perspective? And from a work perspective, this really boils down to getting down to the nitty gritty of what the interactions are, what their style is, and whether it intersects with your style. So let me give you an example, give some real life examples, again, without any names provided. So I've noticed that different people have different needs. There may be one person as a co-founder who simply wants to connect. They're all business. They want to say, what do we need to do? And let's just do it. And then you're done. And then other people, also very capable, also very important to the things you want to do, their performance may suffer if I don't check in with them every couple of days, if I don't feel that emotional connection. Again, each person is going to be different. And what you have to decide is what fits best with your actual style. Let's say that you are a person who really only enjoys written communication. Well, you don't want to work with someone who really relies on face-to-face or telephone communication then, right? If your preferred styles of interaction don't line up, that's going to be a problem. If your preferred styles for learning don't line up, that could potentially be a problem as well. You learn from books, they learn from experience. Every time there's a question that comes up, you say, let's go find a book about it, and they say, let's just try it. And you may be frustrated. Or you can embrace that difference. And you could say, guess what? I'll read a book, you try something, let's get back together and see how those two ideas mesh together. So that's another thing that is really critical, figuring out the nitty-gritty of how the person actually works. And again, the questions I would ask are, so, how do you communicate with people? How many emails do you send in a day? What's the length of those emails? How many texts do you send? How much do you use Slack? What are all the different ways that you work? And you'll be able to figure out whether or not it's a good idea to really work together with them and bring them onto your team. Finally, the last question is, well, that's great. Styles are great. Personality is great. Liking them is great. What about actually getting the job done? And how do I know that they can get the job done? And here's where the principle of reference checking really comes into play. So most of us have hired people. Most of us have been hired at some point in time. And we know how it generally works. There's this interview process where you go in and you talk with one or more people. And these are like half an hour to 1 hour conversations. And based on that, we decide whether we want to work there. Of course, the amount of money they're willing to pay has a big role in that. And they decide whether or not we want them to work there. They decide whether or not they want us on their team. And what I'm telling you is it is a terrible, terrible idea to use the job interview process. I mean, think about it. The job interview process is basically like dating and getting married if you decided that you would decide whether or not to get married after going on one 30-minute date. It's kind of crazy, right? Now, admittedly, there are some reality television shows that even have people get married without ever meeting each other, but that is no way to run your management strategy. Ideally, what you want is the ability to really take advantage of a lot of interactions. Now, in the case of a very important hire, you can invest the time to make that happen. So, for example, my co-author of Blitzscaling and the Alliance, Reid Hoffman, is the co-founder of LinkedIn. And he, 11 years ago, brought in Jeff Weiner to be CEO of LinkedIn. And of course, that's been a very successful 11 years for Reid, for Jeff, and for LinkedIn. Jeff recently stepped down and handed over the reins to Ryan Roslansky and took on the role of executive chairman instead, focusing on diversity and inclusion. And when I asked Reid about what process he went through to bring Jeff on board, he said that they spent probably about 40 hours together before they made the decision to bring him on board, initially as interim president, although really they were bringing him on as CEO. They just wanted a different title so that if Jeff decided he didn't like it, that they could backed out of it without it being too much of a scandal. But that's 40 hours of time that they spent together, deep, intensive conversations. And there were conversations specifically about not just, let's sit around and play Fortnite together, right? Although Fortnite didn't exist then, but rather deep conversation. What happens if we disagree? Well, what were some times that you failed? What are some conflicts that you had? Who's the worst manager you've worked with? Who's the worst direct report you've worked with? All these very in-depth conversations that are about difficult topics that allowed them to really get a basis for how they will work together. Now, if you don't have the time to spare to spend 40 hours with someone, what is the hack that you can use to spend less time but still feel relatively comfortable with what you're doing? The answer is reference checking. Because if you check references, you're checking the references of people who have spent hopefully thousands of hours together, right? It's easy for someone to fool you for half an hour. They could even fool you for a couple of hours. But to fool someone for thousands of hours, that takes some doing. And with reference checking, obviously they're going to give you references, and you should talk to those references. And if those references aren't glowing, then there's something seriously wrong with that person, because they gave you references that didn't actually like them. That's like a big, big red flag. Just toss them out the window right there. But if not, what you want to do is you want to get your quote unquote backdoor references. You want to go ahead and find people who have worked with them. You can usually use LinkedIn for this purpose, and reach out to them and say, hey, I just want to talk and understand not whether this person is good or bad, but what their style is, what their techniques are, what is the best way to interact with them. And in doing so, you're tapping into those thousands of hours of experience those people have. And again, it's very important. You're not asking them, hey, should I work with this person or not? How are they going to know? Their style may be different than yours. You got to be specific. What is their style? How do they work together? What made your relationship good? What were things that could be improved? Don't be afraid to ask those difficult questions, because this is like a marriage. This is like, would you get married without knowing about your spouse's habits, about your spouse's family, about your spouse's friends? Or would you say, you know what? We met for half an hour. I'm good. Here's a ring. Take advantage of the reference checking. And it really is important, and this is really essential, is to do 360-degree reference checking. So someone may be incredibly good at sucking up to others. There are some people in this world, we all know them. They're good at that. Managing upward is a nice way of saying it. And you may talk to the references, and all the people who manage them will say, oh, so-and-so is great, so-and-so is awesome. And if you didn't take the time to network to their peers or the people they manage, you wouldn't hear so-and-so is a blood-sucking vampire. So-and-so is the phoniest, fakest, most evil person alive, right? I'm saying something extreme, but it really does happen. I have had this happen. I've had situations where, again, this is a hard lesson for me. I had a situation where it was very important for me to assess the character of a couple of individuals. And I pulled out all the stops. I pulled strings, probably shouldn't have been allowed to get like performance reviews from all the people they'd worked with, all the people they'd worked for in the past. And they had gotten these sterling reviews. But it turns out they were just really good at managing up and shoveling bullshit to their managers. And they turned out to be a nightmare to work with. And that was a hard lesson for me to learn. And I hope that you don't have to learn it as well. I will add one final nuance, and this is specifically around the different types of people. So we mentioned a couple of different categories of people. Co-founders. With co-founders, what you need to do is you need to figure out what their level of commitment is. Because if you have very different levels of commitment, it doesn't matter if everyone up front says it won't be a problem, it will eventually be a problem. If you are hyper committed and the other person is like, when you're working at 3 a.m. and meanwhile you see their Facebook posts roll in about this video game they're playing or this new thing they bought, you're not going to feel real good about that. And it may fester and explode, or you may talk with them. Either way, it's not a good fit, right? Understand that level of commitment, because that's the fundamental thing that co-founders do. They agree to jump into the foxhole together and stay there until they've won the battle. And if the one person is feeling that the other person is not as committed, that's going to be an issue. When it comes to advisors, the big question to ask is, tell me about how you typically work with previous companies you've advised. Because there's a lot of different types of advisors. There's advisors who lend their name to something but don't actually do anything. And there are advisors who will actually sit down and work with you. Now, again, I want to set the expectation. An advisor is not an employee, right? That is where sometimes people go wrong. They want their advisor to be an employee. They're like, oh, I can't afford this person. So if I give them some stock, they're going to work for me just as hard as if I gave them $10,000, $20,000, $50,000, right? No, the answer is not. Maybe if they really like you, they'll do more work than they should, but really an advisor is there to provide advice, not to execute, right? So focus on the advice side. But it really comes down to find out who they've advised in the past and ask those people, how responsive was this person? That's really the critical question. Like when something happens, when there's a critical situation, you need answers right away. And if you can't get a hold of your advisor for 3 weeks, because 3 weeks out of every month they're sailing a sailboat around the South Pacific with no internet access, that person is going to look great on the advisory board page, but is not going to be of help to you because 75% of the time you can't get an answer right away. So really focus on that responsiveness when it comes to advisors. And finally, when it comes to investors, I'm going to give you my famous advice on how do you evaluate investors. So investors are, as I described them, employees who pay you, which is a great thing, right? Because they are giving you money and then you can often take advantage of their skills in various ways. But as you also know from the various horror stories, investors are not always a good thing. They can behave in ways that are detrimental to the company and especially detrimental to you as the CEO. So how do you find out whether or not you can trust them? The answer is reference checking with a very specific twist. I want you, if you're reference checking an investor, to find some of their failed investments, the investments where they put money in and the company ultimately foundered. Talk to those CEOs and ask them, hey, what was working with this person like? And I will tell you that if the person is a good investor, that failed CEO will say, you know, it was some tough times, but he or she was right there in the foxhole with us. They were trying to help us every step of the way. I could not have asked for a better partner, even though things didn't work out. That's the kind of answer you want to hear. The kind of answer you don't want to hear is, I don't know. I mean, they're great, but then I didn't hear from them for months when we were going through that. Obviously, you know, look, we couldn't have saved it, and I don't know if they would have made a difference. Well, that's just excuse making, right? You want to hear the former, not the latter. So reference check with CEOs where the companies went south. And by the way, sometimes you get some really scary stuff where you're like, oh yeah, no, they were actively undermining the company, or found that they funded a competitor and tried to buy our assets and doing all this kind of stuff. And you can find out some seriously bad stuff. Again, do this via telephone because people do not want to go on the record with on email with this kind of thing. But calls say, listen, let's talk on the phone. I just want to understand the situation. I can assure you that there have been many times in my life when somebody said, when I wrote an email to someone and they said, call me. And I'm like, okay, I know something legal and interesting is about to happen. So look for that, ask the question. If they say, and again, suggest a telephone call because a telephone call is the only way you can have this kind of situation and actually talk about it and feel like you're legally safe. So just to recap, since I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions and answers, the core thing is to build your relationships before you need them. And that involves meeting smart and interesting people, which I'm sure you do every day, and staying in touch with them. And that involves, after the initial interaction, trying to find a way for you guys to interact one-on-one. Could be a telephone call, could be someday, hopefully soon, lunch or coffee. But really get that one-on-one interaction. Get to know them as a person. Understand more about what made them who they are. Think about how happy you are when somebody tries to deeply understand you. That's exactly what you should be doing for them. Once you've been able to actually develop the seeds of that relationship, nurture the relationship. You can stay in touch with them now more than ever with different means like email, LinkedIn message, other social media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many different ways that this can now happen for you. And again, the goal is to make those interactions a positive. You know, you're offering advice, you're offering help. You're not just asking for things all the time. Because, you know, again, the world is not a transactional one where people build up favors and then cash them in. That's a terrible way to look at the world. But on the other hand, if somebody only ever asks you for things and never helps you, how much do you feel like helping them? Not a lot. And then finally, sort of I said, how do you determine who do you work with? Again, if you can spend the time, spend the time. Go deep, ask the tough questions, really dive into the nitty gritty of what's their style, how do they interact, what is the way that they learn. If you can't do that, use the hack of reference checking. Check references in a 360-degree way. Make sure you're catching not just the people that they may have been really good at sucking up to, but the people who are their peers, the people who they manage. And then in the case of those specific individuals, the advisors, it's about responsiveness. The co-founders, it's about commitment. And the investors, it's all about reference checking with the unsuccessful portfolio companies.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. Really appreciate it. So if you have any questions for Chris, we have about 25 more minutes left. So please go ahead and throw them to the chat. They're starting to come in. Before we get to those, Chris, I thought I'd ask one of my own. You spoke a lot about a personality fit, but what about the goals of the company, and that being the goals in terms of what the company looks like, as well as the sort of exit that the founders are looking for? How important is it to have the alignment and goals before jumping in with the co-founder versus simply having a really good personality fit?
So yes, the alignment and goals definitely need to be there. There's a saying that I remember that I always thought was very funny, and it's that all problems between co-founders stem from either co-founders wanting the same thing or co-founders wanting different things. And it's because you're playing with the definition. When they want the same thing, it's because they both want to get the credit, or they both want to be CEO. And when they want different things, it's because they have different goals, right? And so it absolutely is important to check both of those, right? Make sure that your personal goals actually align. Right? It's not that each person wants to run the company. One person may want to run the company. One person may want to run different sections. Maybe it's a classic division is Ms. Inside versus Ms. Outside. Ms. Inside is focused on what's happening inside the company and getting everything to work. Ms. Outside is focused on relating to investors and the press and so on and so forth. Those are all very reasonable ways to divide up that sort of co-founder responsibility. But you have to know in advance how those puzzle pieces are going to fit together. And so that's why it is so critical in talking about co-founders. Yes, let's talk about the mission. Let's talk about the values. Because if we don't believe in the same mission, then sooner or later there's going to be conflict, because different missions, even if they overlap some, are inevitably going to come to conflict.
And should there be a high alignment on exit plans, or do you think that can be fluid?
So I would say that if both sides are like highly dug in to very specific ideas about how it's going to go, then that is an issue. I think that most people don't necessarily know what their reaction is going to be to someone coming along and offering to make them wealthy enough to not work for the rest of their lives, right? This is something which can happen. And for the founders of a company, it becomes a very interesting question. So somebody comes along and offers you $100 million for the company, and it's enough money to make you wealthy enough to not have to work, and the rest of your co-founders not have to work the rest of their lives. And yet you believe that this is a $10 billion opportunity. Well, if you haven't had those discussions in the past, you could be in for a very nasty surprise as you say, no, of course not, we're not going to take this offer. And other people are like, I already signed the documents. So it is really important to discuss that. But that being said, you don't know how you're going to react. You may think that you're one of these, I'm going to build a $10 billion company. But then when the time comes, you're like, I got kids, I got to put through college, my parents are sick, I need money now. Who knows what's going to happen? So be flexible. But ideally, it's not something where people have written in stone, I want to sell early, I want to keep running this company forever.
Great. We have a question from Celine here. How do you determine percentage split equity with co-founders?
This is always a difficult one. And so I have a couple of techniques that I use that helps me to make this work. The first technique is to go ahead and this is a technique that I learned from my friend Don Yates over at Yates Associates, and he's an organizational behavior guy, and I've used this to great effect. What you do is you get the co-founders around the table and have everyone talk about what they think they bring to the table. Here's why I'm valuable to the company. Here's the ways that I intend to create value for the company. And everyone talks. And then you give everyone an index card. And on that index card, they are to write down the percentage of the company they think they deserve. What's the percentage you'd be happy with? And you get everyone to write that down and collect all the cards, including yourself, assuming that you're actually one of the co-founders. And you put everyone's name up on the board and you write down the numbers. And then you add them up. And if the number is less than 100%, congratulations. That's going to be good stuff. It's going to be very easy. But if the number is more than 100%, then you say, okay, well, let's talk about this because these numbers add up to 120. So, let's discuss about what people think. And you have a second round of discussions, and you hand out a second set of cards, and you have people fill it out. And hopefully it's moving in the right direction as opposed to the wrong direction. Right. But that's the process that you have to go through. And what it does is it allows people to sort of expose what they have in their minds, what their assumptions are, because you can't count on you can't count on knowing what people actually are assuming or thinking about their value. And maybe you've even overlooked how somebody is creating value. Who knows? Be open to that. But that is the process that I go through. And then finally, one specific individual technique on top of that is when it comes to the numbers, you don't want people saying, you shouldn't get 20% when I only get 15, blah, 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 going back and forth, creating conflict. What you want to do instead, and I've done this, is say, well, what is the right ratio? Like, so you over there, should you have twice as much as this person or 1.5x? Like, work out the ratios, and then you can solve for the math. Once people agree on the ratios, it's like, oh, well, because of this, we think that it should be 4-to-1, me to you, and the person may agree. Then all of a sudden you're anchoring the discussion, and then you can modify the numbers from there. But have people do the secret ballot of how much they think they deserve and have those discussions. Again, you're not browbeating people into. Eventually I do sometimes. I'm like, hey, if we after having gone through this, I'll often propose a compromise and get people to talk about that and try to anchor them in the compromise. And then part of that is looking at the ratios and saying, if we use these numbers, this person gets twice as much as this person. Does that feel fair to people?
No, I like that a lot. I mean, it forces difficult conversations to take place as opposed to just one co-founder saying, we're all going to get equal shares and we'll move forward from there. And then you could have underlying festering issues.
And even if you do that, by the way, when institutional investors come in, they're going to force you to redo that because they know it doesn't work.
That's right. All right, we have another question here from Taha Lester. What are your thoughts on building a board, not just an advisory board, but board of directors?
Absolutely. And by the way, I just want to mention one thing because I was looking through the comments. I saw Dennis Moore writing in, and I just wanted to shout out Dennis talking about corporate alumni groups because I remember speaking to Dennis about the corporate alumni group he started about 15 to 20 years ago. And it's just great to reconnect and see him on this broadcast today, assuming it's the same Dennis Moore, of course, but shout out to Dennis Moore.
Wonderful.
So in terms of the board of directors, not the advisory board, the way to think about the board of directors, first of all, you don't get much of a choice, right? The choice is essentially made for you in the venture-backed business based on which firms that you work with, and more specifically, which partners at which firms, which is why you need to really carefully reference check those partners, talk to the failed companies that they backed, really understand how they work with CEOs in the past. But assuming that you are thinking about, you have the luxury of being able to choose between different general partners at different firms, then it becomes a question of asking yourself, okay, what do they add to the collective resource set of the company? Like if you say, oh, it's really important that we be able to manage virality. Like virality is the key to everything in terms of what we are trying to do. And then you say, well, if Andrew Chen and Andreessen Horowitz is available, I mean, he coined the term viral loop. He's the guy I want on the board. So it's all about hiring, quote unquote, the board member to provide the skill that you're missing, or to strengthen a strength where you think you can get even more powerful if you strengthen that strength. So think about the board members as employees and think about how their skills are going to dovetail with everyone else you already have.
Great. Can keep going down here. Sunil, as an advisor, how do you define your role in an early stage company without becoming an employee?
So I have to do this all the time because, of course, people that I advise would like for me to be an employee, and I have to tell them no, politely and with gratitude. It's very flattering, but no. And my role as an early stage company is very specific. It's like I have a certain amount of time available, and we make it explicit in the advisory board agreement. You may get away with stealing more of my time if I really like you a lot, and that's okay. But the point of an advisor is not to execute work. The point of an advisor is to provide advice, help you make the right decisions, and potentially help you along with those decisions with a couple of key introductions. That's it. Expecting more from your advisor than providing advice, which again, could also involve looking at something you've prepared, a document, a plan, or what have you, giving their feedback or offering a rewrite or something like that. But again, the advisors are not copywriters, the advisors are not lawyers, the advisors are not there to execute.
And another question from another Sunil. We have three Sunils offering three different questions in a row. It's amazing.
Yes, I saw that. Sunil's A is a very popular name, and B, it's a very a classic name, right? A lot of successful Sunils in this world.
Right. Yeah, I like this question a lot. I think there's a problem a lot of advisors run into, that they're asked to advise a company, and maybe informally say, hey, can you sit down with us for 2 or 3 hours in a day just to tell us what to do? How do you turn that into sort of a formal arrangement where there's some equity involved?
Sure. So what I would say is that there is a basic set of standards, and then you can decide whether or not you can get people to deviate from those standards. The basic standard I would use is for a startup that is pre-funding. So there's no institutional investors in it. It's basically just bootstrapped or something like that. An advisor can be very justified in asking for 1%, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. And the point is that there's so much risk involved then that it really doesn't make sense for the advisor unless it's a significant equity chunk like that. For a company that's past funding, it's seed funded or Series A funded, it may be much lower, maybe 0.25% instead of 1%, so significantly less. And that's because a lot of the risk has been taken out, and so those shares are worth more money. I will say that as an advisor, I do tell people, assume that you're not going to make any money. Like, only do an advisory board membership if you would do it without getting any compensation whatsoever, because in the vast majority of cases, you are going to get zero compensation out of it. It's unfortunate, but true. And so it's really about, do I like this CEO? Do I want to commit to spending time with him or her on a regular basis?
Great. And then the last question from a Sunil is, this is Sunil Tumar. So when you need to build your team out some more, so this is past the initial founders, but you're still pre-seed, bootstrapping your way. So you need to hire some people out and give them some equity. How do you figure that part out?
So the mechanism that I've used in the past is to say, well, let's say we were going to pay you in cash. What would we have to pay you to do this? Now, what is the equivalent value of the equity? Now, once that, it's not just a simple math problem, because once you have the value of the equity, you could argue multiple ways. You could argue, well, this equity is very uncertain, so we should discount the value of the equity, and therefore I should get paid more equity than I paid more to get paid in equity than paid in cash, which, there's some legitimacy to that argument, although I'll point out that all valuations of companies are based around uncertainty, right? It's not based on, oh, this company is definitely worth this right now. It's here's what I think the company might be worth, and we're going to discount that. The second argument might be, hey, this is a hot company. The valuation doesn't reflect the value of the company. You're going to have to take a discount to get paid in stock instead of cash. So those are the two separate arguments. And what I recommend is use the one that's better for you, that you think you can actually defend with a straight face.
Great. And on that, Devendra has a question on the same set of issues here. What if there's a decision between bringing someone on as a founder versus your first actual hire for cash? What's that decision look like?
So I take a position that is somewhat controversial on this one, and I'll give you sort of the conventional line of wisdom, and I'll give you my thoughts. So the conventional line of wisdom is that, if someone is a founder, they're coming in, it's because they were there from at the beginning or close to the beginning. And so typically someone's not going to be brought in as a founder unless you're pre-funding. And again, if three people have been working together for 18 months and then someone comes in and works for them for 2 months, are they going to be considered a founder when they get funded? I don't know, right? Typically not. But my somewhat controversial assertion is it doesn't cost you anything to call someone a founder. I mean, in essence, there is maybe a difference in terms of whether they're getting restricted founder stock or whether they're getting a stock option. That makes a difference. But, typically I'm going to say it doesn't, right? And if the company's successful, you should share the credit around. I think that, for example, I look at the example of my co-author, Reid Hoffman, who's always very careful to label himself a co-founder of LinkedIn. even though everyone knows, obviously, Reed's the main founder and the guy who really is responsible for the company. And where there is, 6 or 7 people who can claim legitimately to be co-founders of LinkedIn or members of the co-founding team. And Reed's position is not to police that and say, no, you can only refer to these 3 individuals as co-founders. It's to make it, to share the credit broadly. And I think that that's the right approach to take.
Great. Another question here from Rakesh. It's on sort of B2B selling. So if you're looking for market expansion, who would you look for help from that? Investors, advisors, other sources?
Yes. So unfortunately, when it comes to B2B selling, it's neither is going to be that helpful necessarily. If it's a venture capital firm, if they have a CIO network, a number of them do, or a technical advisory board, then that can actually be very helpful. So that's the key question. Like, the individual partners are not necessarily going to have enough relationships to make a difference unless they, before in their previous life, were like, a top salesperson at Oracle or something like that. And so it really is a question of, do they have like a CIO advisory board? Or in the case of something like a Y Combinator, do they have a giant alumni base of people who are going to be willing to try stuff out? Advisors, same thing. They're going to have a limited number of introductions they can make, but they're really not going to be able to do that much more. So yes, B2B selling, those people can be helpful in the very early days to get your first 10 to 20 customers, but beyond that, they're really not going to be that helpful. They'll be helpful in providing you credibility to close deals that you yourself develop, but they're not going to help generate the leads for you. By the way, I just want to do 2 things. First, I want to shout out Dennis Moore, because it turns out it was the same Dennis Moore. So I'm glad my memory worked out. I'm glad that after all these years, it's still working out well. And I probably have time for just one more question, because as usual, I'm stacked up with back-to-back webinars. Everyone wants like virtual wisdom in this day and age.
Great. Okay, we'll leave it on this last one then from Hip Gupta. And it's about investors, really. So this is a little far away from our area of founders, but yeah, if investors are want to meet with you and there seems to be a conflict of interest within their portfolio, well, what does that signal to you?
So again, I think it's going to depend a lot on the individual investors. I will say that I would personally not trust that situation. And the reason is, let's say the investor is interested in meeting, they have an indirect competitor in their portfolio. All right, well, if they're willing to meet with people who may be competitive threats to their existing portfolio, what's going to happen after they invest in you? It's the same principle as adulterers should follow, which is, this person is willing to cheat on their spouse, but of course they will be faithful to me. Seems unlikely. So I would generally shy away from those kinds of meetings if you believe there's an indirect competitor. Now, again, you have to be honest with yourself. Like, some people may say, their portfolio includes Amazon, and Amazon sells things and we sell things, therefore they're a competitor, right? Scope it appropriately. But if there is somebody who really is a potential competitor, then the companies that are most honorable are not going to do that meeting. And you should recognize that if anyone's willing to do that meeting, then they're willing to do that meeting with someone else when the shoe is on the other foot.
Great. And we'll leave it at that. Chris, as always, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate your thoughts. So for everyone on the call, thank you for your time as well. We have our next webinar in the series with Chris on July 2nd, which the topic of that is scaling for success. So goes right into the theme of blitz scaling. So if you have time to read through that next month, I would probably recommend it. I think that would be good prep for the next webinar, right, Chris?
Absolutely. And I'll remind everyone that if you enjoy hearing my very fast-talking, joke-filled kind of content, you can go to chrisye.com. You can find my blog there. You can follow me on Twitter. You can sign up for my email newsletter, and you'll learn more about me from Silicon Valley Forum and other places.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Chris. And just a heads up, if you want to see a recording of this, it'll be on our website later today. And I think we'll be emailing it to you as well. So you can have this wisdom for the rest of the time that we're in this situation. So Chris, thanks a lot. On to your next meeting. And thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Nick.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.